There is a small town in the far northern reach of Michigan where, for 110 years, the same night has been relived every single winter. The snow falls on Calumet the way it always has, heavy and indifferent. And when Christmas Eve comes around, 73 candles are placed on the ground in the middle of a quiet park, one for each person who never made it home from a party. A party that began with laughter and a Christmas tree and children singing carols, and ended with a word. One word, shouted by a man whose face no one could clearly see, whose name no official record ever confirmed. That word was fire. There was no fire. And in the 2 minutes that followed, the most joyful afternoon this shattered community had known in months became the worst disaster in the history of Michigan, and one of the most haunting unsolved tragedies in American history. This is the story of Italian Hall. To understand what happened inside that hall on Christmas Eve, you first have to understand the world that had been building toward it for decades. Calumet is located on the Keweenaw Peninsula, a narrow finger of land that juts out into the freezing waters of Lake Superior in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It is one of the most isolated places in the continental United States, accessible by a single rail line, surrounded by water on 3 sides, buried under more than 15 feet of snow for 6 months of the year. It is a place that, on paper, has no reason to exist at all. But beneath its frozen surface lay something that the entire industrializing world needed desperately, and that discovery changed everything. Copper. Pure, native copper, the richest deposits ever found in North America. When the first mining operations broke ground in the 1840s, Michigan quickly became the top copper producer in the entire country, feeding the wires and cables and machinery that were electrifying American cities and homes. By the time the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company formed in 1865, backed by investors from Boston, it was already clear that whoever controlled this ground controlled a fortune. At its peak, Calumet and Hecla, the company known simply as C&H, had more than 21,000 employees, generated 16 million pounds of copper in a single year, and paid over $72 million in dividends to its shareholders, the equivalent of more than $1 billion today. It was, by any measure, an empire. The company did not merely employ Calumet. It owned it. C&H constructed the streets, the schools, the libraries, the churches, even the opera house. It built the houses where the workers slept and the stores where they spent their wages. The company was the government, the landlord, and the employer all at once. And that arrangement came with a particular kind of power that extended far beyond the mines. A worker who was fired did not just lose his job. He received a 15-day eviction notice for the home where his children slept. If a miner died underground, his widow and children were expected to vacate within days to make room for his replacement. There was no medical coverage for the injuries that were, in the darkness of those shafts, essentially inevitable. 1 out of every 200 men working in the copper country did not survive the year. The men doing this work were not from here. They came from Finland, Croatia, Italy, Slovenia, Austria, Hungary, and Eastern Europe, drawn by the promise of steady wages in a country that was still, for millions of people across the world, the great American dream. They arrived speaking no English, settled in neighborhoods that followed strict ethnic lines by design, and found themselves working the most dangerous and least desirable positions in the mine. The Finnish immigrants, who would eventually form the largest ethnic community in the entire Upper Peninsula, were particularly active in the politics of labor, and their socialist newspapers published in Calumet were read by thousands. The Croatians, the Italians, the Slovenes, they all brought with them a hunger for dignity that no company town could satisfy. And for years, decade after decade, they went underground every morning knowing that they might not come back up. The man who ran all of this in 1913 was James McNaughton, the general manager of C&H, a figure the Finnish press called the Tsar of the copper country. McNaughton was not interested in sentiment. He was interested in production and profit, and when the copper seams began to run thinner and deeper, requiring men to dig further and harder for less yield, his solution was an engineering device that the miners called the Widowmaker. It was called the one-man drill. Before its introduction, every underground drill was operated by 2 men, one drilling and one watching, one keeping his partner alive in the dark. The one-man drill eliminated the partner entirely. It halved labor costs and doubled output. It also meant that a miner working deep underground had no one to call for help if something went wrong. MacNaughton introduced it without negotiation, without warning, without any consideration for the men whose lives it would govern. And that decision lit the fuse. By the spring of 1913, the Western Federation of Miners had been organizing in the copper country for 5 years, and for the first time, it had enough membership to move. The union held a meeting in June 1913 attended by over 2,000 workers, and the speeches that day were delivered in English, Italian, Finnish, Croatian, and Hungarian, because that was the only way to reach a workforce that had been deliberately kept apart by language for generations. The four demands they brought to the company were precise and modest. A pay increase to $3.50 a day, a shorter workday, recognition of the union, and the removal of the one-man drill. C and H refused to even schedule a meeting. On July 23rd, 14,000 miners across 3 counties put down their tools at the same moment and walked out of the mines. Not a single shaft opened that morning. The strike had begun. MacNaughton responded with everything the company's resources could buy. He called in the sheriff, who immediately deputized 200 C and H employees to patrol the streets. He sent word to the governor, who dispatched the entire Michigan National Guard to the region. The Finnish press called the soldiers the Michigan Cossacks, and the description was not entirely unfair. They broke up union meetings, harassed picketers, and provided cover for the Waddell men, the professional strikebreakers imported from New York, who raided union offices and attacked workers who stood in their way. And out of this climate of organized intimidation, a new organization was born. The Citizens Alliance, formed in November 1913 by Calumet's business class and funded by the mine interests, positioned itself as a force for order and community stability. The striking miners understood it for what it was. It was the company in civilian clothes. Into this charged and increasingly violent atmosphere stepped a woman named Anna Clemick, known to everyone in Calumet as Big Annie, and the name came from her physical presence. She was 25 years old, the daughter of Austrian immigrants, and she stood 6 feet tall. Annie Clemick founded the Women's Auxiliary of the Western Federation of Miners and led it with a ferocity that made the company's newspapers write about her constantly. She marched daily at the head of the picket lines carrying a massive American flag, and she was arrested 3 times for confronting strikebreakers. Her so-called Broom Brigade, women armed with household brooms, became one of the most defiant and visible symbols of the strike. She went to jail for 10 days and came out still marching. Through 5 brutal months of a Michigan winter with no wages and dwindling food, it was Annie Clemick who held the community together, and it was Annie Clemick who, in December 1913, began organizing what she hoped would be a single afternoon of happiness for the children of the miners. On 7th Street in Calumet, between Elm and Pine, there stood a 2-story building built of Jacobsville sandstone, the warm red rock quarried from the shores of Lake Superior. It was constructed in 1908 at a cost of $25,000 and designed in the Romanesque Revival style by architect Paul Humphrey McNeil, with arched windows and a carved stone entrance that gave it a dignity that stood apart from the functional grimness of the company town around it. It belonged to the Società Mutua Beneficenza Italiana, the Italian Mutual Benefit Society, and it served as the cultural headquarters for Calumet's Italian immigrant community, offering aid, fellowship, and a place to gather in a language they understood. The building had 2 lives. On the ground floor, a saloon owned by a man named Dominic Vero occupied the southern side, and a branch of the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company occupied the northern. But the real life of the building happened upstairs. The second floor held the grand hall itself, with a stage at one end, a dining room, a bar room, and room enough for hundreds of people to gather for the weddings, dances, union meetings, and community events that were the social fabric of immigrant Calumet. It was here that people came to feel, for a few hours, like they belonged somewhere. There was one way to reach that second floor. At the front of the building, framed by the arched sandstone entrance, a door opened into a small foyer. Straight ahead, through a set of inner doors, began the staircase. It rose steeply upward in a single flight, 5 feet and 9 inches wide, climbing 38 feet from the street to the hall above. At the top, the staircase opened into a small vestibule before entering the hall. There was a fire escape attached to the exterior of the building, and ladders propped against the back wall, accessible through second-floor windows. But neither was clearly marked, neither was visible from the floor of the hall, and neither was something that a crowd of frightened people would think to find in the dark. The staircase was the only way out that anyone knew. and it was barely wide enough for two people to descend side by side. Annie Clemick had spent weeks collecting donations from unions across the United States to fund a Christmas party for the striking miners' families. The response was generous. Money came in from labor organizations in New York, Chicago, and across the Midwest, and with it she arranged gifts, candy, and food for a community that had been living on nothing since the summer. Entry to the party required showing a red union card at the door, a small but deliberate boundary, a way of saying that this afternoon was for the families who had given the most and asked only to be treated as human beings in return. For many of the children waiting in line on 7th Street in the cold on December 24th, this party was the only Christmas they were going to have. By mid-afternoon, the hall was full to capacity. Estimates placed between 500 and 700 people inside, the vast majority of them children. For many days, the children had waited expectantly, as one contemporary newspaper account put it. They had rehearsed carols. They had prepared recitations for the stage. Santa Claus was there, and presents were piled around a large illuminated Christmas tree at the front of the room. The piano played. Children danced. Somewhere inside that hall, amid the music and the laughter and the smell of food and pine, there were families who had spent a long and frightening autumn afraid, cold, and uncertain about the future, and for a few hours they were simply together, and it was Christmas. Then hold this image. Let it exist for one moment more, because what came next happened without warning, and it happened in less than 2 minutes. It was late afternoon, around 4:40, when the children were lining up at the stage to receive their gifts from Santa Claus. The presents were being handed out one by one. The hall was loud and warm, packed wall to wall with bodies that had come in from the December cold. At that moment, a man appeared at the top of the staircase. Witnesses would later describe him in fragments. A coat with the collar turned up, a hat pulled low over his eyes, impossible to identify. He did not walk into the hall. He stood at the entrance, shouted the word fire 2 times into the crowd, and then walked back down the stairs and disappeared. At first, nothing happened. There was no smell of smoke. There was no heat, no glow, no crack of a catching flame. Several people near the stage did not even react at first, and some of the women at the front of the hall began shouting for calm, calling out that there was nothing wrong, asking people to stay seated. Annie Clemick herself rushed toward the center of the room, arms raised, trying to hold back what she could already feel beginning to move. But the word had already traveled to the back of the hall, passed from mouth to mouth in multiple languages, and the part of the human brain that responds to that word does not wait for confirmation. It moves. The crowd moved as a single mass toward the only exit it knew. Everyone in that hall, a majority of them children, turned toward the staircase at the same moment. The physics of what followed are devastatingly simple. The staircase was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The first people to reach the bottom tripped or stumbled in the rush, and the people immediately behind them could not stop. The weight of hundreds of bodies pressing downward from above created a force that no individual person could resist. People were driven off their feet. They fell. Others fell on top of them. The staircase became a sealed column of compressed human weight, and at the bottom of it, men, women, and children were being crushed and suffocated under a pile of bodies that was growing by the second. A 10-year-old boy named Ted Typulus, the son of a Finnish striking miner, managed to reach a second-floor window and climb out before the staircase sealed. He escaped. His 2 younger sisters did not. Ellen was 7 years old. Mildred was 5. He never saw them alive again. In the same crush, 3 brothers named Heikkinen were caught in the staircase together. Eli, Aino, and Edwin, all 3 sons of the same family. It was Edwin's 7th birthday. None of them survived. A husband and wife named Abram and Marie Niemela were in the hall with their infant child. As the crowd compressed around them, they raised the baby above their heads in the only gesture of protection available to them. They were killed. The baby lived. When the crush finally subsided and the rescuers were able to clear the staircase, what they found at the bottom defied description. Bodies were piled one upon another, so tightly compressed that in some cases they had to be physically separated by hand. Parents who arrived at the scene in the minutes after the disaster did not understand what had happened. Fathers and mothers rushed the building, trying to force their way inside and reach their children, and the police formed cordons to hold them back while the bodies were carried out and taken to the Red Jacket Village Hall for identification. For many hours, parents ran from hall to hall uncertain whether their children were alive or dead. Several bodies were misidentified and taken home by mothers, only to be returned when the right family was found. Some parents never had that uncertainty. They already knew. The Red Jacket Fire Department arrived and searched every room, every corner, every inch of the building for the source of the fire that had killed over 70 people. The entry in their official log that evening was 4 words long. No fire. The Christmas presents were still stacked around the tree upstairs, untouched, exactly where Santa Claus had left them. 73 people were dead. 59 of them were children. The morning after the disaster, Charles Moyer, president of the Western Federation of Miners, did what no one else in Calumet felt safe doing. He publicly named the Citizens Alliance as responsible. He stated that an alliance agent had entered the hall deliberately and shouted fire with the specific intention of disrupting the union event, breaking the spirit of the strike, and terrifying families who had already endured a season of unrelenting intimidation. He refused to retract the accusation. Within a few days of making that statement, Alliance members tracked Moyer to his hotel in the nearby town of Hancock. They beat him, they shot him in the back, and they dragged him through the streets and threw him onto a train to Chicago with a message that he was never to return to Michigan. Moore did not comply. He arrived in Chicago, went to a hospital, and then held a press conference where he stood before reporters, turned around, and showed them the gunshot wound in his back. He described exactly what had happened, announced that he would be returning to Michigan, and vowed that the investigation into Italian Hall would continue. It was a remarkable act of defiance. It was also, as it turned out, the last moment when anything about this case moved forward in any meaningful way. The coroner's inquest began within days of the disaster and lasted 3 days. It was, in the most generous reading, an inadequate proceeding. The hall had been filled primarily with immigrant families, Finns, Croatians, Slovenians, Italians, most of them speaking little to no English. At the inquest, witnesses who did not speak English were required to answer questions in English, with no interpreter provided. Most witnesses were not asked follow-up questions. Many of those called to testify had not been in a position to see what happened and had nothing useful to offer. After 3 days, the coroner issued his ruling. It did not identify a cause of death for any of the 73 victims. It named no perpetrators. It reached no conclusions. It was, in effect, no verdict at all, but buried within the testimony of that inquest and expanded significantly in the congressional investigation that followed in March of the following year, was a detail that no amount of official silence could entirely erase. Across multiple sworn testimonies, witnesses described the same thing. The man who had shouted fire was wearing a badge on his coat. It was a white button, the kind issued to members of the Citizens Alliance. A 15-year-old boy named John Burker, whose 12-year-old sister Victoria had died in the staircase, told the inquest directly and without hesitation what he had seen. He hollered fire and then ran out, Burker said. He had an Alliance button on his coat. He was not the only one. A woman named Anna Lustig confirmed the same detail. Another witness described having seen the same man in town weeks before the party, carrying a club. At the congressional hearing, where witnesses were finally provided with interpreters and allowed to testify in their own languages, 8 people under sworn oath independently described the Citizens Alliance badge. In a gesture that was either spectacularly tone-deaf or deliberately provocative, the Citizens Alliance formed a relief committee in the days after the disaster and collected $25,000 to distribute to the bereaved families. The offer came with a condition. Moyer had to publicly clear the Alliance of all blame for what had happened. He refused. The families, honoring his position and the promise of union aid, also refused the money. The Alliance then attacked Moyer. For decades, a second theory about the disaster circulated, and it centered on the building's doors. According to this version of events, the doors at the base of the staircase had been locked or opened inward, physically preventing the crowd from escaping and directly causing the deaths. It was a powerful and emotionally resonant story, and it found its way into books, historical markers, and most famously into Woody Guthrie's ballad, which accused the Copper Boss's thug men of holding the doors shut. The problem is that it almost certainly is not true. Every existing photograph of the doors shows a double-set opening outward. Architectural blueprints of the building confirm the outward configuration. When historian Steve Leto examined the full transcript of the coroner's inquest for his exhaustive 2006 book, Death's Door, he found that the doors were not mentioned as a contributing factor by a single witness. Not in the inquest, not in the congressional hearing, not in any newspaper coverage from the time. The doors were not what killed those people. The staircase was, and the panic that drove hundreds of people into it simultaneously. Leto's research went further, drawing on coroner transcripts, survivor interviews, architectural analysis, and newspaper archive from across a dozen cities, including papers that covered the story from Detroit, Chicago, and New York. He concluded that the person who shouted fire was most likely an ally of mine management, acting with intent. In the second edition of his book, published years after the first, he went further still and named a specific individual he believed to be responsible. It is a name that has never been tested in any court of law because no charges were ever filed, and no one in authority in Calumet in 1914 had any interest in finding that the Citizens Alliance bore responsibility for the deaths of 73 people. The congressional investigation closed in the spring of 1914 without actionable conclusions. The Union, its funds exhausted, and its membership broken by the accumulated hardship of the strike, followed by the psychological devastation of Christmas Eve, ended the fight in April. The miners returned to work. They did not receive union recognition. They did not get the removal of the one-man drill. Many of them came back to find that the men who had taken their jobs as strikebreakers were still employed, and they were the surplus. Thousands of families left Calumet and never returned. On December 28th, for days after the disaster, the town of Calumet buried its dead. Coffins had been express shipped from across the state because there were not enough in the entire copper country to hold them all. The small ones, the ones for the children, were white, and flowers were laid across the lids. Horse-drawn hearses moved through the streets in a procession that stretched for 3 miles. 20,000 people lined the route, for deep on the sidewalks, some climbing trees to see. Eulogies were delivered in Croatian, Finnish, and English, the same 3 languages in which the miners had been told for years that they did not deserve better. The procession ended at Lake View Cemetery, on a hillside overlooking Lake Superior, where the small white crosses were planted in rows in the frozen Michigan ground. Some of those who survived never fully came back either. A boy named Ted Typolis had escaped through a second-floor window, while his sisters Ellen and Mildred were crushed on the staircase below him. He grew up, made a life, and decades later returned to Calumet for a social event. Someone suggested going upstairs to watch a dance that was happening on the second floor of a building on 7th Street. Ted Typolis climbed the stairs, looked through the door into the hall, and realized where he was. He saw the staircase. He had to leave immediately. He told people afterward that he never wanted to go back. He never did. Between them, in the ledger of the dead, were children from nearly every immigrant family in Calumet. The youngest was 2.5 years old. The oldest was 66. Hilja Lanto was 5, and her mother Maria was 40. They died together. Mary Claridge was 9, her sister Katerina was 7, and her sister Christina was 11. Frank and Josipa Claridge buried all 3 daughters in a single week, and their small headstones stand in a row in the cemetery to this day. Johan Kaskila was 10. Anna Kotajarvi was 4. Sulo Lori was 8. 50 of the dead were Finnish-American. 13 were Croatian. 7 were Slovenian. 3 were Italian. All of them had come to this frozen peninsula at the edge of the world looking for something better than what they had left behind, and they had found Calumet, and Calumet had taken everything. Italian Hall continued to stand on 7th Street for nearly another 5 decades after the disaster, used for community events, gradually falling into disuse as Calumet itself slowly emptied of the workers and families the tragedy had driven away. In October 1984, the building was demolished. The decision provoked significant opposition from residents and historians, and in the end, only one element of the original structure was saved. The stone archway, built of Jacobsville sandstone, the carved frame that had stood above the entrance to the staircase, was preserved and re-erected on the empty lot where the building had stood. It stands there today, in the middle of a small park maintained by the Keweenaw National Historical Park, and if you walk through it, you are walking through the same entrance that 700 people walked through on the afternoon of December 24, 1913. On the other side, there is nothing. The staircase is gone. The hall is gone. There's only open sky and, in summer, grass. In 1940, A folk musician from Oklahoma named Woody Guthrie heard about what had happened in Calumet and wrote a song called 1913 Massacre. The song told the story through the perspective of the labor movement, and it placed the blame squarely on the copper bosses and their hired men, claiming that the doors had been held shut from outside. Historians have disputed the accuracy of specific details in the song, but the song did something that the official investigations had refused to do. It remembered. It gave names to the grief, put the whole catastrophe into language that ordinary people could carry with them, and it kept the memory alive in union halls and folk festivals for decades when the history books were silent. Arlo Guthrie, Woody's son, carried it forward into the next generation and the generation after that. The song is still performed today. The legacy of Italian Hall rippled outward in ways that are still felt in everyday life. The disaster contributed to a growing national awareness of the dangers of poorly designed public assembly spaces, particularly the catastrophic vulnerability created by a single, narrow, steep staircase as the only means of exit for a crowd of hundreds. The principle that public gathering spaces must have multiple clearly marked emergency exits, that doors in public buildings must open outward to allow unobstructed egress in a panic, that occupancy limits must be enforced, all of these protections, now encoded in fire and building codes across the United States, were shaped in part by tragedies like Italian Hall. When Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in a Supreme Court opinion in 1919 that the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man who falsely shouted fire in a theater and caused a panic, the disaster at Calumet was part of the cultural and legal memory he was drawing from. The people who died on that staircase helped make every crowded room in America safer. In August 2018, on the 105th anniversary of the disaster, a black granite monument was unveiled in the park at the Italian Hall site. The stone, 8.5 feet wide and 4.5 feet tall, was sourced from India because of its durability, and it was carved with every name. All 73 of them. For the first time in more than a century, every single person who had died at the bottom of that staircase was acknowledged in permanent stone. Raphael Leeser, 2.5 years old. Edwin Heikkinen, 7 years old, on his birthday. Ellen and Mildred Typelis, 5 and 7. The three Claridge sisters. The Niemela couple. The girl listed in old records only as Toepo, girl, name unknown, who now finally has her name carved alongside the rest. The dedication ceremony was held on December 24th, the 105th anniversary of the disaster, and it was attended by descendants of the victims who had traveled from across the country to be there. Every Christmas Eve since the year 2000, the Calumet community places 73 luminaries at the Italian Hall Memorial Site. One candle for each person. They are set out in the dark and the cold of a Michigan December, and they burn through the night on the same date, at the same hour, in the same place where it happened. The town of Calumet is smaller now than it was in 1913, much smaller, quieted by more than a century of departure and decline. But those candles still draw people from across the region, descendants of the dead, residents who carry the story in their family memory, visitors who have made the long drive north through the snow to see what remains of a building that no longer exists. What they find is the archway, the stone monument, the names, and the light. No one was ever charged for what happened on December 24th, 1913. No official body ever named a suspect. No family ever received an apology or an acknowledgement or any form of justice for the loss of their children. What they received instead was silence and the particular cruelty of a coroner's verdict that could not even bring itself to list a cause of death for 73 human beings. And so the question that has hung over this story for more than a century, the question of who walked into that hall, pulled his hat low, and shouted fire into a crowd of children, remains officially unanswered. But the names are carved in stone now. And every December 24th, in the far frozen north of Michigan, the candles burn for them. All 73.